My background then is in the interest of professional knowledge and learning, both in the education and work context. And what I will highlight today is what I call knowledge practices. That is how professionals and professions deal with knowledge, do knowledge collectively, and all the kind of strategies and reasons and ways of handling knowledge that is typical for specific professional groups. So I know that I'm not covering the whole issue of what it means to be a professional. I'm focusing on the knowledge issue, but I do so in a cultural way. As cultures that are enacted and from the idea that professions also make up cultures for how we handle knowledge and the reasons we deal with knowledge to meet specific problems and clients in society. So in that sense, I'm interested in what transformations in knowledge and the way knowledge is circulated and produced and dealt with in society influence professional work and learning. So with respect to the last day's keynote, it was about media practices and the changes that come about from that. I will focus more on knowledge practices, what happens with knowledge in the transition towards knowledge societies. The outline looks like this. I would first give a brief account of one way of understanding what happens on our way towards the so-called knowledge society and what happens with knowledge in that respect. I will then look at some implications for professional work and learning, what it might mean for changes in professional work, and then introduce a perspective on how we can understand professions as expert cultures that are constituted by their ways of dealing with knowledge. Knowledge practices are the enactments of knowledge cultures and how this is done in different professional fields. So I would look at some examples also from our empirical projects on what it might mean for opportunities for learning and conclude with some implications for education and research. As a starting point, this quote is from the sociologist Karin Knorr-Cetina. She has worked very much with expert cultures, both in the sciences and in other domains. She has looked at financial traders, different types of more or less professionals that have a certain kind of knowledge as basis for their work. And her claim here is that the emergence of the knowledge society is not only about more experts and more specialists rather than participant interpretations. This is one of the claims from Anthony Giddens, for instance. But what she says is that it's also about the presence of knowledge processes themselves. Our societies are very much marked with knowledge on its travel. It's distributed through web pages, through standards, through practices that are interlinked in different ways, and these processes influence our lives and work. So this piece of work from Knorr-Cetina is, by the way, from the book Reiner cited yesterday, the Practice Turn in Contemporary Theory book, which he edited with Schatzky and others. If you look at drivers for the changes in society, what are the drivers behind the emergence of the knowledge society? One of these is a general emphasis on science-generated knowledge and verified, secured knowledge inputs, so to speak. But this is not only about evidence-based practice and that movement. It's about what happens when practitioners are faced with expressions of knowledge that are believed to be secured from researchers or other institutions and need to make it relevant in their local work. So the more we have of expressions of science-generated knowledge, the more there is a challenge for practitioners to make use of it and understand what does it mean for my practice, what does it mean in our organization, and what does it mean in relationship to this patient, this client, this child. So in the space between here, there is a need for a lot of knowledge work. We need to engage with knowledge to translate it, to make it relevant, to make it useful. And also there is a range of inputs coming up from different sources. You can get different advices for what we actually should do with this child with this kind of problem. And you need to negotiate different inputs and see what you can trust in different situations and so on. So this requires analytical work. It requires engagement with knowledge itself. There is also a tendency to more use of advanced instruments and representations. And these instruments and representations are not ready to use. They require also analytical work and what I call knowledge practices. These are just some representations. This one is from a software system. This is from a requirement specification where software engineers are asked to develop estimates of what it takes to make this system. And then they have to interpret this system. I could never do that. And it's a lot of analytical work. It needs to be discussed. It needs to be tested out. It requires knowledge practices. In the upper corner is a little piece from a software system for accountancy. It's an environment where accountants work and perform their work. I will come back to that in an example later. And the latest one from a medical situation. So all these kind of representations and instruments contribute to require analytical work, require knowledge practices of different kinds. A third form of driver is the development of standards at different levels. Standards are a manifested thing that often are treated too straightforward. There is a strong belief, for example, from politicians, that you can just put the standards into an organization and it will work. But we know it's not that happens. People really need to try to open up what these standards mean. How can we use them? How can we specify them for our cases? And so on. So all these standards that flow around also requires knowledge work and ask people to, hey, engage with us, see what you can do with us, see what it means in different situations. One interesting distinction is made by Timmermans and Berg in their book on the gold standard from health professionals, medicine. And they distinguish between what they call performance standards, procedural standards, terminological standards. Different types of standards address different aspects of professional work. So standardization is not one thing, and it matters what kind of standards you have and how they play together. And often professionals will need to deal with several of them. You have, for instance, procedural standards that say that this is the procedure you should follow with this patient or this client. And at the same time, you have certain expectations in terms of output and performance standards. You should do like this, keep your budget down. And how do you relate these together? We also know that standards take different forms and come with categories that get established. This is just one impression of that the cuts of beef is not straightforward either. And the Australian have a third version. You can find it on Wikipedia. What appears as the same animal is not when you look into it. And it means that standards are done in different ways. They are realized in different ways in different environments. But at the same time, they are upheld by practices. So it's the practices of people, the collective ways of doing it, that keep them stabilized and continued in a way. So, but if you look at all these type of drivers together, I think they generate what I've called a quest for transparency in the processes of work and in the basis for decisions. So professionals are much more often now required to be able to show to clients and other stakeholders what is the basis for this work you have done now. Why is this decision right for me? Why is this decision right for my child? And how did you get to that solution in an engineering system, for instance? This has to do with monitoring of professional work, and it is often discussed as something that kind of restricts professional actions and subjectivities and so on. But I would say that it's twofold. It does that if it's very detailed, regulated. But at the same time, the quest for documenting what you do is also an input to start to analyze what you are doing, start to write up what the procedures, what you have done, and this is an analytical work that in some sense resembles researchers' work to describe their environments, what happens in my experiment, what is the basis for taking the next step forward in this way, and so on. So, one argument is then that these trends contribute to bring about more epistemic modes of practice in many types of work. People engage themselves in examining, analyzing, testing out, validating why should I use this type of procedure instead of this one, why is this right for this client and not this one, and to document what they do. And in many work environments, these processes happen in a collaborative form, so it's not only about the single practitioner's judgment, but it's about how it's dealt with in the team, in the organization, in the different teams of professionals. And to go back to Karin Knorr-Cetina again, which we have used quite a lot in our work in Oslo, she claims then that what we witness is a kind of a spillover of epistemic cultures into other areas of social life. So it's not to claim that all workers, all practitioners, all people in their everyday life now act as scientists. That is not the point. But that we more and more rely on different types of knowledge practices that are much more advanced than applying given knowledge to specific cases. We are asked to elaborate, examine, explore, test out, develop further, refine, specify, all this type of engagement. So, we have already mentioned some of the implications for professional work and learning, but one implication, I think, is that many professionals are faced with extended responsibilities. And with that, I mean that the spectrum of their tasks is getting wider. So they have a responsibility for working with their specific clients, their specific patients, and so on. But they also need to engage in a kind of meta-reflexive way with what is the basis for what I do with this client, and what is the basis for the collective way we do things in my organization, in my workplace. And these extended responsibilities has also to do with making sense of all these kind of general resources that enter workplaces and are to be translated into different forms of work. I will give some examples later, but we have in our studies of Norwegian professionals seen that also very recently graduated professionals are faced with quite extensive responsibilities for understanding, for instance, scientific knowledge and what they can do with it. So, yeah. I think also one implication is that their work, it has perhaps never been just about problem solving, but it's increasingly important also to be able to find problems and to frame them so that you know what kind of problem is this and where can I go to try to find resources that can help me. And I think this requires also being involved in a specific domain of expertise so that you have resources to help you to see, is this a social problem? Is it a medical problem? Is it an identity problem? What is at stake? And it's really hard to prepare people for that during education because the world of work is so variegated when they come out and meet different situations. There is also an emergent future-orientedness. An idea that things are going to change during my working life and they might change next year or next month. So how can I prepare for that and how can I be a bit in front of what is happening? This varies a lot between professional fields, how much that is present. It's very much in engineering and not that much in teaching, for instance. But I think generally people today have an expectation that the world is changing. I'm not going to do the same as my parents did for my whole life. So one take on this is that it is increasingly important to learning also the techniques, procedures and principles for how knowledge is handled in the profession and the area of expertise. And that is important for critical engagement and for agency so that professionals do not get subordinated in the standards regimes, for instance, but are able to discuss them, see where they come from, what can we do with them, what does it mean for us. And that means also meta competencies in dealing with knowledge. So these are basically what I call knowledge practices, how this is done, how do people do knowledge in collective ways. But I would just like to mention that it's not necessarily that narrow, that it's only about knowledge. It also carries values, it carries embodied skills, because these practices are enacted by people and they are always imbued with purposes. So value systems and so on are intertwined with the knowledge issues. Some questions of concern then is, how do practitioners take part in knowledge practices in their respective organizations and fields? And we can raise that question both in the educational context and in the work context, and how they go or not go well together. And also, what role do these knowledge practices play in linking practitioners and their work or their engagement with their wider knowledge culture? And then I'm thinking about, how do people in a specific workplace in nursing get linked with the wider developments that happens in the field of nursing? How do people in a specific educational program, by dealing with knowledge and problem solving a certain way, also get access to what happens in my accountancy profession these days? What is at stake, and how do knowledge develop? And I think it's not given that every practitioners have the same opportunity to participate in all this, because what we also see that it's increasingly demanding, and we can get different systems in workplaces and so on that come with divisions of labor, and some are very close to following the advancements and others are left with the routines. So how this is distributed is also an issue. And this quote is from Jan Nesbor's 1994 book where he analyzed two programs in higher education in physics and management. And he stated that we need to look at communities, in this case in the educational programs, but also in work settings. Professional communities, for instance, are not just situated in space and time. They are ways of producing and organizing space and time, and setting up patterns of movement across space and time. So how do the way knowledge and practice is organized in one community facilitate people's movements across space and time, so that they can know about what happens other places while they are performing work in the local context, and how do these things contribute to learning? Then I move to the third issue about looking at professions as expert cultures. The sociology of profession is very much looking at professions as kind of groups that claim jurisdiction of an area of knowledge and create boundaries around their work, and really control the access by educational programs to be able to practice and be allowed to practice and so on. I think it's more interesting today to look at these professions as expert cultures that together try to use and develop and take care of an area of knowledge that can be useful in society. And if you look at what constitute expert cultures, they are often what we call object-centered. What they have in common is that they are oriented towards the same set of problems and the same set of what I have called problem knowledge constellations. That might be, for instance, what do you do with people with diabetes? It's a problem, and it has a lot of knowledge and research and things, instruments, measuring instruments and so on linked to it, and all these form a kind of a problem knowledge constellation. Or how do you actually help children to develop their literacy in today's society? Could be also a set of a problem with lots of knowledge linked to it. They are also formed by what Karin Knorr-Settina again calls machineries of knowledge construction. That means that it's not a stabilized set of knowledge, but there are ongoing mechanisms and processes that develop and distribute and keep knowledge more or less in motion. So the machineries of knowledge construction is what makes up how we know what we know, as nurses, as social workers, as teachers. How we know what we know is really dependent on what kind of instruments, what kind of artifacts, what kind of texts, what kind of research processes, what kind of knowledge sharing practices come together to make up that. And these machineries, they comprise multiple sites and agencies. In some professions now, we get, for instance, agencies at the meso and macro level that take part in this. The Cochrane collaboration, knowledge verifying agencies, standard setting bodies, and so on, are also part of this. What informs professional practice is a complex set of activities and agencies. And I think it's interesting to look at these machineries as something that span the education work divide, because if you look at it in that way, what constitutes nursing knowledge today, then education and workplaces play together into that. So sometimes we get a bit locked in to look at what is in education and what is in work, but if you look at the knowledge domains, they interplay in interesting ways, but not always without conflict, so there are tensions. These expert cultures are enacted, they are performed, they are done through practices, through the knowledge practices that are shared, and they are linked with belief structures. So they come with and incorporate ways of understanding what is the purpose of knowledge, what is the purpose of this type of work, what is the natural way of distributing knowledge and responsibilities. Should we have a specialist professional and generalist professionals, or should we have all equal, or should some people have more access and responsibilities for some parts of these practices than others, is also part of this. So in that way, they also really form professional identities in the sense of what does it mean to know something in my profession. What we have done in Oslo in our project is a series of 3 projects now. There are other things going on as well, but this is what I have been involved in and partly leading. And we have had 2 projects over a 7-8 year period that built on each other, and both projects targeted nursing, teaching, accountancy, and computer engineering from a kind of comparative perspective. We were interested in looking at how knowledge was organized, distributed, dealt with in these fields. And it also included case studies of knowledge practices around new artifacts, because we were interested in seeing what happens in a workplace when a new standard comes in, when a new procedure for nursing comes in, when your teachers are asked to develop their collective assessment practices in new ways. So this is kind of selected sites for studying knowledge practices, because when something is at stake, these practices are invoked. What we are currently doing is to take it back to higher education programs that prepare professionals and look at how do students in higher professional education get access to practicing these knowledge practices during education, and how do that link them to their professional culture, also both in when it comes to skills and identities and ways of thinking of themselves as professionals. So, because what we saw in the first projects was that it was quite differences between how enrolled, how socialized, how embedded professionals were in their expert cultures from their educational programs. So we found that education seems to matter, and then we want to see what happens there. But the last project has just started, so we have to wait a bit with the results. We have just collected the first data now. To give you some examples from the former 2 projects about knowledge practices. This is from nursing. We interviewed nurses that had graduated for 1 to 2 years ago, and we interviewed them again a year later to see how they, as more or less novices in working life, continued to learn, approach knowledge, and looked at themselves as practitioners in development. And this nurse, she has worked for about 2 years, And she told about how she went to conferences in the European Respiratory Society. She was in a clinic that dealt with asthmatics problems. And she went out from her workplace, attended conferences to learn about developments in her fields. She also explains here then that when she comes home, she had exchanged experiences with others, but then she took the initiative to form a group of nurses across different workplaces in Norway that is devoted to the development of procedures for tests, for lung tests, to ensure that this is done in a consistent way throughout the country. And as I said, the doctors do not do the testing themselves, so they saw this as the nurse's responsibility to take care of this part of the knowledge machinery because the doctors were not enough close to it, was her claim. And this can lead to several things, but it is an initiative to secure and develop knowledge in her special field. It's a way of gathering people around a problem knowledge constellation and working with it. And they do it beyond the scenes of the specific patients and move back and forth between these spaces. So it resembles the evidence-based nursing procedures in many ways. I picked this figure from, it's from Rosfer and Larrabee in 1999 and modified by Mohid and Kukur in this article. Just to, I mean, it's not that straightforward, but it includes knowledge practices. You have to assess evidence, you have to synthesize, it can lead you out in an inquiry loop to raise new questions, to raise the question of how is it done other places, what can we do with this, and the design and implement processes, as is it called here, is not straightforward processes. If you open up each of these, it's a set of knowledge processes involved to be able to design, to be able to implement, lots of complexities inherent there. So for nurses that apply the procedures these people develop, it may be more restrictive on their professional actions, but for the nurses involved in the processes themselves, they really engage in a variety of knowledge practices. One example from computer engineering. This is from a system administrator. So she was responsible for the big system in an organization. It was a girl, by the way, as a computer engineer. That's not that common. And she said, you have to continuously read about the system you use, and then you discover something untried that could be of interest. And the most important thing is to realize the potential of the system you are working with. As you learn more about it, you see more opportunities. So she engaged herself in a very inquiry-oriented way. What can I do with this? What can we use it for? Can we develop more functionalities here? And so on. And it led her out to test out things and to verify things and to engage in a variety of knowledge practices. And finally, an example from auditing. This is a software system for doing auditing that is called Descartes. It's developed in Norway and used by 75% of the auditors in Norway now, so it's really common, and it's also about to be launched on the international scene. I guess it's not easy to read the small details here, and it's not necessarily either. It's just to give you an impression of the structure. It's a kind of when you hand in your annual report to the government in the country, you fill in information and you follow these tags and so on. So it's some of that structure. But what happens is that they work in this system from start, and they perform first a planning phase early in the annual year for auditors, where they decide what do I need to check for this client, what do I need to gather of information, what do I need to enter in the system. And then you also do kind of analytical work on what to include and what is important in this case. And then they go out and gather information, and they get it from the client, and lots of processes are involved, and they control for it at a later stage. But this planning phase is a future-oriented way of working, so they don't just look back at numbers in their financial reports. They engage with the business in a future-oriented way. And in the upper corner here, they have to you have to tag what they called assertions Here exemplified with completeness, validity, accuracy, periodification, classification. These assertions should be checked in complex ways for different types of financial information and for different types of firms. But it's not straightforward. What is validity actually here? What is accuracy? You have to engage in types of analytical work to make decisions on that. There was an interview very tied to filling out and doing this work that is quoted here, that she said that when you control costs, its validity you check, right? You know that as an auditor, probably. But then you see a cruise to Amsterdam. Well, that cost is not quite valid. It shouldn't be in there. So, so just as one example, so they engage in looking in assessing the information. And this quote from on the top is from the International Standards of Auditing from 2009 that introduced risk auditing to deal with the Enron case and these financial scandals. That the auditors should look into what is the economic welfare of this entity also for the future. And the auditor here describes that in B3, one point in the Descartes system, one of these pages, you do it out on the clients and you consider what other shops are here. What is the competition like? How does the management look? Is this people who are really having control of things they're doing, or is this a mess? And as she says here, you will soon discover who is well organized and who is perhaps not so organized, and what are the other shops and who is managing what and so on. So this influences also the information put into their system. Which means that they go out and collect information, analyze it, relate it to other information, engage in assessing, validating information. And by doing so, they deal with the standard very tightly because that is operationalized in their software system. And in that way, they are also linked with wider developments in the accountancy profession because new standards come into this system regularly and change the basis for their work. So they have the feeling of being part of an international accountancy profession while they are doing the work in this specific firm. So, I couldn't give the full basis for these claims in this rather short talk. You can read more about it in the book that Franziska mentioned. But what we see across the different data types and projects we have been involved with is that some factors that matter for the learning opportunities, and then I'm thinking about learning as the opportunity to take part in knowledge practices and explore knowledge and work beyond what is given and routinized, so that you are in a movement of exploration and expansion. Then it seems to matter that work communities are linked with wider circuits of knowledge, that you are linked with developments from science, developments of standards, developments of experience-based knowledge, and so on, but that you have resources that inform your work that do not only come from your local workplace, but are interlinked with a wider environment. This is also about having a rich material culture, because the way these links are made are through artifacts, through infrastructures, through the tools and devices and instruments that people work with. So technologies actually helps a lot on that issue, but they also create challenges from moving from the machine to the patient or to the human being. It seems to be important to have the opportunities for variegated participation, so that you don't organize the profession that you take care of the validation of knowledge and you actually apply it. But engaging people in more of these practices gives a sense of understanding for the wider machinery, which also can provide them with agency to act and reflect and critically engage. Where do this knowledge actually come from? Can I trust it? Is it the best for us? Shared professional language and procedures are important. What we saw was that a group of professionals that struggles with that is the teaching profession. because they had a language that was very much experience-based, and the language that they used to talk with their pupils, the students. And the professional language was not that much up in their conversations. And when that is not present, you can't in a way generalize the case and problem you face to something that are of more general value and that can give you information about how to deal with it. So in Norway now, the teacher union, based on this project partly, at least they have picked it up, they are really having a project where they try to strengthen the professional language and make that more visible in the profession. So without language and procedures, it's difficult to share knowledge in practical terms. You can be informed by readings, but how do we do it and how do we practice it? And there we found also some reinforcing mechanisms, so that people who were very well embedded in these expert cultures, they were more capable of acting in sophisticated ways, assessing, and also then having more agency, you could say, in their work. So it matters how we introduce people to this during education, because it gives a potential for active engagement and critical engagement. Finally, some implications for research and education from these perspectives. I think it's important that we think about, in the theoretical accounts, how do we theorize and think about practices. I think it's very important that we account also for the epistemic and material dimensions of practice. The social interaction is important, but the content, what do they interact about and what mediate that interaction is really important. So the special issue Franziska mentioned that I've edited with 2 colleagues tries to come to terms with what we call socio-material perspectives on practice to bring the material dimension also more into the cases. I think also it's important to distinguish between different knowledge practices to really open up what do people engage in. So saying that they do their practice is very general, but what's in that practice? And how are the practices of verifying, exploring, discussing, assessing, how are all these different types of engagement interlinked? And practice as dynamic and emergent, multi-layered and interlinked. That is about practice as something that is all in the movement. It's emergent, it comes up in new ways, it's also stabilizing what has been done and creating patterns over time, but we need to look at what happens in the dynamic of redoing practices. And it's multi-layered and interlinked. That means that it's not only about what happens in the local workplace or the local educational program, it's about how do the resources invoked in those activities link with what happens other places, other times with other people. And it happens on the very local level of a few individuals, and it happens also more on the profession level. What is the movements for nurses more generally? I think as researchers that we need to look at practices if we are to study practices. That means to study processes of enactments and what are people actually doing and how do they do it. But also to link that with the wider machineries of knowledge construction so that we don't get too narrow focus on 3 people and their action today. So we need to understand those interlinks. And Davide Niccolini, he has written an article that he calls Zooming In and Zooming Out when studying practices, looking into what is the interactional patterns of these 4 groups, 4 people, and then zooming out, where do the resources they draw on come from? How is this interlinked with the Cochrane collaborations work? How is it interlinked with other places? And for the educational practices, I think involving people in knowledge practices is also about involving them in inquiry-oriented activities, in problem solving, but also problem finding. And as part of this, in actions of justification, actions of discussions, where you have to validate, assess, and justify. Why do you think this is a good solution to the problem? So these articulations of the reasons and ways of thinking are important. I also think that keeping people doing both explorative and what I call the confirmative modes of practice is part of this dynamic, because you learn when you explore something new. What can I do with this that I haven't tried before, and what can this actually also mean in other situations? But then you need to come to a closure to be able to use it for a specific task, and then you can open it up again and follow new lines of inquiries. So how can we help people move between opening up, closing temporarily down, opening up again? And then finally, the integrated curriculum and the well-aligned curriculum is, of course, something that many programs strive for. But one question here is then, what does it actually mean? Because one issue is to create a well-aligned curriculum between the goals and purposes and the assessment outcome structures and so on. But this is also about then how can we align all these different agencies and movements and processes that operate in the machineries. So how can we align educational practices with work practices, with what we know from recent research, with what we know from what works and not works other places, and so on. So when we span out the time and space for understanding professional practice, the question of integration also comes up in new ways.